They shoved my wife to the ground on our own front porch. I didn't throw a punch. I built a case that brought their entire operation crashing down. I'm a retired soldier, just trying to live quietly in a suburban neighborhood, until the HOA declared war on us. Let me take you back to the day everything changed. Have you ever been fined over something absurd? Tell me below. After 3 decades in the Army, most of it spent far from home, in deserts and mountains where silence could be fatal, I had one dream left: peace. So when Emily and I finally packed up our lives and moved into Silver Pines, it wasn't for the view, the amenities, or even the security patrols. It was for the promise of stillness, a garden, a porch, a place where we could exhale. Silver Pines looked like that kind of place. Quiet cul-de-sacs, freshly mowed lawns, neighbors who waved, at least from a distance. Emily loved the backyard, immediately said she could see herself planting herbs, brewing her teas again. I saw the oversized garage and pictured myself rebuilding that old rocking chair I'd carried through 3 duty stations. We signed the papers in under an hour to celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary. I built her a trellis, not store-bought. I mean, hands-on, plan-measured, sandpapered for hours kind of built. I shaped it from red cedar, strong enough to withstand both weather and time. Emily cried when she saw it, happy tears, the kind you hold onto in your chest like medals. She planted morning glories that same evening, humming some old tune from our early years. 3 days later, the knock came. I should have known it wasn't a neighbor dropping by to borrow sugar. The man at our door looked like a gym ad come-to-life tight polo shirt, clipboard, and a badge clipped to his belt that read, Compliance Officer. His name was Bryce. He didn't introduce himself as a neighbor, just went straight to it. Your garden structure violates HOA Regulation 14C, subsection 3, he said, without even a hello. All architectural modifications require prior approval. I blinked, nodded slowly. Didn't realize a trellis counted as architectural. It does, he said, handing me a fine notice. That'll be $500. It needs to be removed within 48 hours or the fine doubles. I took the paper, not looking at it. Would it be possible to apply for approval retroactively? He let out a short, amused breath. Regulations are regulations, sir. No exceptions. That's how we keep this community orderly. He turned and walked off, tapping something into his phone like he'd just completed a tactical op. I stood there on the porch, trellis behind me, wondering what we'd really moved into. This wasn't about property values. It wasn't even about rules. It was about control. And something about the tone of Bryce's voice, the smug confidence, the lack of human decency set something off inside me. This place wasn't the peaceful haven we thought it was. It was a kingdom, and people like Bryce were the ones who thought they ruled it. I didn't know it then, but that single knock would be the beginning of a war, one not fought with fists or weapons, but with something far more powerful: strategy, patience, and truth. I stood there on the porch, the fine notice still in my hand. Bryce's footsteps fading down the walkway. Emily came out a few moments later, wiping her hands on her apron, the faint scent of rosemary and chamomile still clinging to her sleeves. She looked from the paper to my face, and without needing a word, understood something had shifted. The trellis was just the beginning. Within 5 days, we received 4 more violation notices. One claimed our lawn exceeded the 3-inch maximum height by ½ an inch. Another said our garbage bins weren't properly concealed, though they were behind our fence. A third cited our mailbox color as non-standard, despite the fact that it was the same color as when we bought the house. The final one targeted Emily's herb garden, accusing her of growing unauthorized vegetation, medicinal herbs, for her patients. The total amount of fines, $1,925.52. I stared at the figure printed neatly in bold on the latest notice and felt that old operational calm settle into my bones, the same calm I felt before missions in hostile territory. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were testing boundaries, seeing if we would break, fold, flee. Emily didn't break. That night she stood at the kitchen sink, arms crossed, eyes firm. If we back down, they win. And it won't stop with us? I agreed. But I needed more than outrage. I needed facts. So I started with the HOA bylaws. Dozens of pages dense, dry, full of contradictions. It took me 2 nights and 3 pots of coffee to get through the whole thing, highlighting inconsistencies and noting language that could be interpreted in our favor. Then I began documenting. I took early morning walks around the neighborhood with my phone camera, snapping photos of other homes with similar violations, trellises, herb gardens, non-standard mailboxes, and not a single citation on their record. I'd bet my last deployment check. One afternoon, while snapping a photo of a yard with an even taller trellis than ours painted bright red. No less. I heard a gravelly voice behind me. "They get you too." I turned. The speaker was a man in his 60s, thick mustache, tan windbreaker, and a cane that looked more decorative than necessary. He introduced himself as Patrick Dorsey. "I'm a retired detective," he said, extending a firm hand. "Been watching this HOA for a while. Thought I was just being paranoid. But now, you're the 3rd neighbor this month hit with stacked violations." He invited me in for coffee, and I accepted. His home was modest, warm. His wife, Denise, offered me a slice of banana bread before disappearing into the garden. We sat in his study, the walls lined with case files from his former life. "That woman running the board, Miranda Kane, has made a habit of using the HOA like her personal fiefdom," he said. 3 families in the last year sold their homes under pressure. Each got buried in fines, threats of liens, all after crossing her. One of them just asked to see financial records. That caught my attention. "You think she's hiding something?" I asked. He nodded. "I can't prove it, but I've seen enough to know when someone's cooking the books. Her lifestyle doesn't match her income. New Lexus, spa weekends. I checked her last job was as a property manager 20 years ago. Nothing since." I thanked him and promised to keep him in the loop. On the way home, I couldn't stop replaying one thing he said: "They create pressure until people break. The trick is not to break." The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday night. Emily and I arrived 10 minutes early. The room was pristine white walls, neatly lined chairs, a row of bottled water at the front for the board members. Miranda sat in the center, dressed in a dark green blazer with a gold brooch that caught the light whenever she turned her head. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, smile measured, and cold. Beside her sat a wiry man with glasses and a stiff posture, fingers twitching every time a document was handed his way. The treasurer, his name tag read Simon Weeks. When the floor opened for resident comments, I stood and calmly raised the series of violation notices we'd received. "I'd like to understand the selective enforcement of these regulations," I said. Because I've documented at least 8 homes in Silver Pines with similar structures and landscaping that have received no citations. Yet my family has been cited 5 times in a week. Miranda's lips curled slightly, as if amused. "Mr. Carter," she said my name sharp on her tongue. "You're new to the community. I understand it takes time to adjust. But these rules are here to maintain our property values and community standards. If others are out of compliance, we'll address them in time. And the fines I asked, they seem disproportionate." Simon, the treasurer, shifted in his seat. Miranda didn't glance at him. "Fines are outlined in the bylaws," she said evenly. "If you're unwilling or unable to comply, perhaps this community isn't the right cultural fit for your family." There it was, the threat beneath the velvet glove. But what interested me more was Simon. When I mentioned fines, his eyes darted down to the papers in front of him. His pen scratched a little too quickly. Nervous tells, "In the field, We called those entry points weaknesses in a fortified wall. I didn't push further that night. Instead, I noted the names of the board members, the cadence of their speech, their reactions when certain topics arose. Intelligence gathering. Every campaign starts there. As we left the meeting, Emily leaned close and whispered, "She thinks we'll leave." I looked up at the rows of perfectly trimmed hedges, the identical mailboxes, the silence of conformity. She doesn't know what kind of war she just invited into her kingdom, because this wasn't just about trellises or mailboxes anymore. It was about something rotten beneath the surface, something that smelled like money, power, and fear, and I intended to follow that scent until I found the source. Whatever they were hiding, I would expose it. And this time, they picked the wrong neighbor. They picked the wrong neighbor. Those were my exact words leaving that HOA meeting. I meant them. But even I couldn't have predicted how quickly they'd test my resolve. Just 3 days later, their campaign escalated into something else entirely. Something no longer petty. Something personal. It was a Thursday evening, late enough that the sun had dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows across our lawn. I was in the garage, sanding down a cedar board for a bench I'd promised Emily. The steady rhythm of the sander had become a kind of therapy, smooth, predictable, unlike the chaos brewing just outside our door. Then I heard it, a cry sharp, human, and full of pain. I dropped the board instantly. In 2 strides, I was outside. Emily was on the ground at the base of our front steps, her left arm clutched tight against her body, face contorted in agony. Bryce stood just feet away, flanked by 2 other HOA personnel I'd never seen before. One held a clipboard. The other was filming. "What the hell happened?" I barked, moving to Emily's side, years of emergency combat training kicking in as I scanned her for injuries. She refused to allow an inspection. Bryce replied, his voice flat, defensive. "Per Article 12, we have authority to enter and inspect properties at any time with cause." I looked up at him slowly. What cause? She had unauthorized planters along the side yard. We knocked. She didn't answer. So we began the routine walkthrough. She was home alone. She became aggressive, he added, eyes narrowing, and tripped while attempting to block our path. Emily's breath came in short, ragged bursts. I supported her weight gently, careful not to jostle her arm. "Shoulders out," she whispered through clenched teeth. "Might be torn." I saw red, not the kind that makes you reckless, the kind that tightens your vision, that slows your breath and sharpens your focus. I had seen this before in war zones and interrogations, people abusing power behind the flimsiest veil of legality. "You've made a mistake," I said to Bryce, my voice low, controlled. "A serious one." Rebecca, our neighbor, appeared out of nowhere, phone already recording. Her husband Patrick followed, eyes scanning the scene like the detective he used to be. I didn't have to say a word. He was already dialing 911, "Call the police." I told him. "We're filing an assault report," Bryce scoffed. "Officer Moreno's on call tonight. He's familiar with our protocols. This'll be cleared up quickly." He was right about the officer's familiarity. Officer Moreno showed up 20 minutes later, barely glanced at Emily, and listened politely as Bryce spun a story about a misunderstanding during a compliance walk. She tripped. Moreno said to me with a shrug, "It happens." Emily, her face pale and lips pressed thin, refused to speak. Not because she couldn't, because she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a single complaint. We drove to the ER. I sat silently in the waiting room as they reset her shoulder, my hands clenched tight, feeling like I was back in a sandstorm bunker, unable to reach my team. The X-rays revealed no fracture, but a possible rotator cuff tear. She would need rest, physical therapy, and at least 2 weeks off work. When we got home that night, I stood in the doorway for a long time. Something had shifted in me. Not rage, not revenge. purpose. They hadn't just gone after my wife. They had injured the one person who'd stood by me through every deployment, every nightmare, every moment I didn't know who I was anymore. The woman who had waited without complaint, nursed my scars, believed in peace even when I only knew war. This wasn't about a trellis or bylaws anymore. This was war, but not their kind of war. I wouldn't strike back with fists. I wouldn't give them the escalation they wanted. I'd dismantle them piece by piece, rule by rule, truth by truth. That night, I turned our dining room into a mission command center. I brought out the whiteboard, markers, notes, HOA bylaws, property records. I mapped the board members Miranda Kane, President, Simon Weeks, Treasurer, Bryce Williams, Enforcement Lead, and the silent accomplices who voted without questions. Emily, despite the pain, sat beside me. "They think no one will fight," she said quietly. "They're used to fear." "I'm not afraid," I replied. "I just needed a reason." Patrick came over the next morning. He had already started compiling files. Complaints that had gone ignored. Financial summaries with vague entries, consulting fees, landscaping adjustments, payments to companies that didn't exist. "They've been funneling money somewhere," he said, "but I never had the leverage to do anything with it. Until now." Rebecca, always 3 steps ahead, had already spoken with a friend at the local paper. "We'll keep it quiet for now," she told us. "But when the time comes, I want this story front and center. The public has no idea how out of control some of these HOAs can get." She handed me a folder. Inside were notes about Miranda's late husband and accidental death from carbon monoxide poisoning in their garage. The investigation was led by Officer Moreno. No autopsy, no inquest, closed in less than 48 hours. My military instincts screamed this was bigger than power trips and landscaping rules. This was a micro-empire, built on fear, maintained through control, and protected by corrupted authority. They thought we were alone, but they were wrong. Emily's sling didn't stop her. She started speaking with neighbors quietly, sharing our story, asking questions. Within 3 days, we had 12 accounts of similar harassment, selective enforcement, threats of fines, a woman forced to remove a disability ramp for her son. A veteran fined for flying the flag a few inches above regulation height. I called Tom that night. He was a former Marine turned attorney. Emily once saved his life after a crash on Route 5, 36 hours on shift, and she stayed awake until he stabilized. He hadn't forgotten. When I explained what was happening, he didn't hesitate. "I'm in," he said. "No charge. Let's burn this down the right way. Not with matches, with documents." We began drafting, filing, requesting full financial disclosures under state HOA transparency statutes, demanding records, challenging citations, preparing for court, if necessary. They had rules. So did we. But we had something stronger: discipline, purpose, and the will to expose what they'd tried to bury under paperwork and fear. That night, I stood by Emily's side in the garden. She looked out at the vines on the trellis, bruised but still blooming. "They broke the wrong part of me," she said. I nodded, my jaw set. "Now we break their system." We weren't just going to break their system, we were going to expose it from the inside out. But to do that, we needed more than outrage and anecdotes. We needed intelligence, documentation, leverage. So, we built our own war room, not with concrete walls and encrypted comms, but right there in our kitchen next to the coffee maker and Emily's jar of dried chamomile. The trellis stood outside as a quiet symbol of what they tried to destroy. Inside, I started mapping every thread I could pull. Patrick was the first to step fully into the trenches with me. His background as a detective proved invaluable not just for his instincts, but for his meticulous methods. He didn't deal in hunches. He dealt in patterns, paper trails, motive. His wife, Claire, was just as vital. A reporter for the county's independent journal, she had a knack for digging in places no one wanted her to look. Within 48 hours, Claire began requesting access to public financial disclosures from the HOA, something most residents didn't even know they were entitled to. She reviewed contractor names listed in the budget reports Miranda's board had distributed at quarterly meetings. The same three companies kept appearing: Sterling Landscapes, Axis Security Consulting, and Brookview Administrative Solutions. Patrick raised an eyebrow when he ran the corporate addresses. "All three are registered to P.O. boxes in the same strip mall," he said. Claire pushed further. The registration records linked the businesses to a woman named Lynette Kane, Miranda's sister. It was the first undeniable thread of corruption. The board wasn't just overreaching, they were using their position to funnel association funds into what appeared to be shell companies operated by relatives. Meanwhile, Tom, our Marine-turned-attorney, filed formal requests for the HOA's financial ledgers under our state's mandatory transparency statute. The law required that all HOA financial records be made available to residents upon written request. We sent 3 letters by certified mail. No response. I knew enough about pressure to recognize hesitation in a system. The silence wasn't ignorance. It was stalling. While waiting, I began building a relationship map. Using a large whiteboard, I plotted out every known connection, Miranda at the center, with Bryce, Simon the treasurer, and 2 additional board members as her lieutenants. Each had a line connecting them to either questionable enforcement decisions or opaque financial movements. Bryce, in particular, had always rubbed me the wrong way, not just for what he did to Emily, but for how he seemed too comfortable carrying out illegal inspections. Claire did some digging and found something we'd suspected but couldn't prove. Bryce had a sealed court record. With a few favors called in through old contacts in the court clerk's office, she confirmed it: domestic violence, 2014. Charges dropped. No details available to the public. Now we understood his aggression wasn't just professional, it was habitual. Miranda's husband, dead 3 years ago from what was ruled an accidental carbon monoxide leak, had left behind a relatively modest estate. Yet Miranda, since taking over the HOA presidency, had upgraded from a Honda to a new Audi, started sporting designer handbags, and had installed an in-ground pool that violated the HOA's very own fence height regulations. It wasn't a question of whether she was abusing power. It was how deep the abuse ran. Every evening, Emily would join me at the table, reviewing minutes from past HOA meetings that Claire had recovered from the town clerk's archive. Emily may have been injured, but her mind was sharper than ever. She noticed something I hadn't: every major budget increase in the HOA's spending on consulting, enforcement, or administrative support came within weeks of residents selling their homes under financial distress. In other words, they weren't just exploiting the budget, they were manufacturing turnover to free up houses for resale. And who handled those sales? Patrick found the name Kane Realty Services, owned by, of course, Miranda's cousin. At this point, we had a working theory. Miranda used arbitrary code enforcement to drive out dissenters or target homeowners with vulnerable circumstances. She imposed fines, refused to lift them, then pressured them into moving. Her cousin's firm handled the resale. The HOA bought cheap services from fake companies. Money cycled between relatives while residents lost their homes. It wasn't mismanagement. It was organized theft. Tom began drafting a complaint for the state's Office of HOA Oversight, citing multiple violations of transparency laws, misuse of funds, and abuse of authority. We gathered affidavits from residents, some willing to go on record, others anonymous, detailing patterns of harassment and retaliation. We had photographic evidence, inconsistencies in the annual reports, contractor records, and Miranda's expanding personal assets. But we still needed one more thing: real-time proof of manipulation or internal collusion. And for that, we had to play close to the flame. I started showing up to every open HOA board meeting quietly, legally recording everything. I asked routine questions. I brought coffee for other residents. I appeared cooperative, even apologetic. They began to lower their guard. Simon, the treasurer, started to sweat every time I asked about budget items. At one meeting, I asked whether the landscaping contract for the east entrance was bid competitively. Miranda brushed me off. Contracts are awarded internally. The board ensures they meet community needs. But who reviews them? I asked. And who audits that process? That's not something we're obligated to discuss, she replied coldly. Later that week, I found Bryce peering through our front window again, camera in hand. I stepped outside calmly and asked, "Looking for something specific?" He flinched. "Routine check. Make sure you get a good shot of the trellis," I said, still standing. He didn't reply. Just walked off. I called Tom. "They're pushing again." "Good," he said. "That means they feel pressure. Keep it up." By week's end, our dining room had transformed into a full-fledged command center. The whiteboard held an intricate web of connections. The corkboard next to it displayed pinned notices, meeting agendas, time-stamped photos. Claire was preparing a series of articles. Tom had prepped 2 legal complaints and a cease and desist letter. Emily was cross-referencing dates of citation spikes with sales data from Patrick's files. We weren't just collecting facts anymore. We were building a case. A quiet war had begun, fought not with noise, but with silence, patience, and paper. And every lie they built their empire upon was about to be brought into the light. The case we were building had grown too big for backroom strategy and quiet surveillance. It was time to go public, to move from observation to confrontation. Every connection, every document, every quiet conversation had led us to this moment. And the next HOA meeting was our first battlefield. I arrived at the clubhouse 30 minutes early. Not out of nervousness, SEALs don't do nervous, but because I wanted to set the tone. I wore a buttoned shirt, no tie, sleeves rolled presentable, calm, unmistakably serious. In my backpack, I carried copies of every violation notice we had received, time-stamped photographs of similar infractions ignored elsewhere, and most damning state statutes highlighting transparency requirements that the board had repeatedly violated. By the time the board members filed in, the room was already half full. Some residents nodded as they passed. Others looked down, unsure of where they stood. Miranda sat in the center as always, her blazer as sharp as her expression. Simon trailed behind, adjusting his glasses, carrying a slim folder I knew contained just enough paper to look official without saying anything. The meeting followed its usual script updates, announcements, and then public comments. That was my cue. I stood, walking slowly to the front of the room. "My name is Jack Carter. My wife and I moved here 9 months ago, seeking peace and community. What we found instead was intimidation, selective enforcement, and what I believe to be a pattern of financial misconduct." The room fell quiet. Miranda's smile stayed frozen on her face, but her eyes sharpened. "I understand this meeting has an agenda," I continued, holding up a printed packet. "But according to Article 7, subsection 3 of the HOA bylaws, residents are permitted to address safety concerns at any scheduled meeting, and that's what this is, a matter of safety." I distributed the packets, each one containing photos, highlighted bylaws, and a sworn witness statement from Emily about her assault. Rebecca had formatted them beautifully, with footnotes and a cover page that simply read, "When rules become weapons." Miranda tried to cut me off. "Mr. Carter, this isn't the time," Article 7.3, I repeated, calmly but firmly. "I'm well within my rights. And if you refuse to let me speak, we will treat it as a violation of resident rights under state HOA law." That shut her up. I detailed the incident involving Emily, the physical injury, the dismissive police report, and the fact that one of her assailants, Bryce, was never disciplined. I then moved on to the financial discrepancies contracts awarded to Miranda's sister, enforcement bias, and the refusal to comply with public records requests. Simon visibly began to sweat. I wasn't angry. I was methodical, clinical. The room watched not a ranting homeowner, but a man in control presenting evidence, citing law, making it harder for anyone to dismiss what I said as emotional. Doug, one of the quieter board members, spoke up. This is a lot of accusation. Mr. Carter. No, I said. It's documentation. What you choose to do with it will tell us whether this board serves the community or itself. I finished to silence. Not applause. Not outrage. Just tension. A room full of people reevaluating the balance of power. The next morning, I took Emily to her physical therapy appointment. Her arm was stiff, sore, but she insisted on continuing her shift at the hospital afterward. That was her way of fighting showing up, healing, helping others. I couldn't have asked for a stronger partner in this war. That afternoon, I got a text from Patrick Check hospital intake records. Bryce just came in. Motorcycle crash. Not serious. Room 2B. I told myself to leave it alone. But when I stopped by to bring Emily dinner that evening, she was just walking out of room 2B. Her sling off. Her movements slow but precise. You treated him? I asked, surprised. She nodded. He needed someone. He was scared. I do my job. I looked past her into the room. Bryce was lying on the bed, left leg in a brace, a scrape across his forehead. He glanced up and stiffened when he saw me. I started to step forward, but Emily touched my arm. Let me. She walked back in, adjusted his IV with careful movements, and handed him a cup of water. Bryce looked at her, confused and wary. Why are you being nice to me? He asked. Because dignity isn't earned, she replied. It's given. There was no heat in her voice, just the kind of clarity that makes a man reconsider everything. On the way home, I didn't say much. I just kept thinking about the look on his face, guilt. Maybe. Or something softer, the early stages of regret, a crack forming in the wall of certainty he'd built for himself. Later that night, I stood in our kitchen staring at the whiteboard we'd filled with arrows and names and timelines. Bryce was there, pinned under enforcement. I picked up a red marker and drew a small question mark beside his name. Cracks mean pressure, I said aloud. Emily looked up from the table. You think he's turning, maybe. If he starts questioning her, the whole foundation weakens. She nodded. Then we keep pushing. Not too hard. Just enough. Claire's first article went live the next morning behind the fence. How HOAs silence homeowners. It didn't mention names, but it outlined the tactics: selective enforcement, intimidation, financial opacity. It struck a nerve. By lunchtime, it had over 4,000 views. The comment section was flooded with homeowners from other communities sharing similar stories. This wasn't just a local problem. It was systemic. That evening, I received an anonymous envelope in our mailbox. No return address. Inside was a photocopy of what appeared to be a bank transfer, $15,000 paid from the HOA account to Axis Security Consulting. Below that, a note written in block letters. That company doesn't exist. We were gaining traction. But more importantly, we were gaining allies. And the war had officially gone public. The anonymous envelope confirmed what we already suspected: there were fake companies draining real money from our community. But it also marked a shift. Until now, we'd played a game of exposure and pressure, hoping that truth alone would fracture their operation. It was time to escalate. If they wanted war in shadows, we were ready to drag them into daylight. Tom filed the official complaint with the State Department of Community Oversight that Monday morning. It was 73 pages long, backed by documented financial irregularities, resident affidavits, photo evidence of selective enforcement, and most damning of all, corporate registration records tying all three vendor companies, Sterling Landscapes, Axis Security, Brookview Admin, to Miranda Kane's family members. The document read less like a complaint and more like a criminal indictment. Simultaneously, Rebecca, publishing under her full name for the first time, released her exposé, The HOA That Became a Private Bank. The story hit hard. Clean formatting, striking headline. And within the first paragraph, the line in silver pines, "The rules weren't broken, they were weaponized." That piece went viral in our county. HOA watchdog groups picked it up. Within hours, the board called an emergency closed-door session. They were panicking. That's when Bryce called. I was working late at the kitchen table, organizing footage from our security cams. When the phone rang, I hesitated. His number wasn't saved, but I recognized the last 4 digits. I answered. "They're planning to plant something in your truck," he said. I didn't respond immediately. I waited. "I didn't sign up for this," he added, voice low and uneven. "They're desperate. Miranda told Officer Kevin to handle it. He's going to drop it in sometime between 2 and 4 a.m. Then he'll come back on shift, get a call from an anonymous tip. And you're done. Arrested. Career ended. Still. I didn't speak. "You have a wife," he said. Softer now. She treated me like a human being after everything. I couldn't let it happen. I nodded once, even though he couldn't see it. "Thank you," I said finally. After I hung up, I called Patrick. 2 hours later, we had motion-activated cameras installed under the eaves, inside the garage, and 3 hidden units around the truck. Every angle covered, every second time-stamped and stored off-site. I cleaned the truck thoroughly. Nothing left behind but a pack of gum and a service manual. At exactly 2:17 a.m., a figure approached. He wore black, moved with the casual entitlement of someone who believed the world owed him immunity. He glanced once over his shoulder, then pulled open the truck's passenger side door. He leaned in, reached under his coat, and tucked something under the seat. At 5:46 a.m., the same figure returned, this time in uniform. It was Officer Kevin. "Mr. Carter," he said, knocking on the door. "We received a call about possible narcotics in your vehicle. Mind if I take a look?" I feigned groggy surprise. "Seriously, drugs? That's insane. We can do this the easy way," he said, trying to sound polite. "I've got nothing to hide," I told him. "Go ahead." He searched, opened the glove box, rifled through the back seat. Then he found it. A small black pouch beneath the passenger seat. His face lit up not with triumph, but with something colder. Expectation. Well, he said, holding it up. "Looks like someone's got a secret." I crossed my arms and looked him square in the eye. "You might want to check what's inside." He unzipped the pouch and looked down. Sugar. Granulated baking sugar. His face changed. First confusion. Then the color drained. He started. I stepped forward. "There's a reason it's sugar. You planted it at 2:17 this morning. I've got the footage high definition, front, side, and interior cams. Copies already sent to my lawyer, the police chief, and the state attorney's office." For a moment, he stood frozen, the pouch still in his hand. Then his partner, who'd arrived moments earlier for backup, looked between us. "What's he talking about?" "Kevin, officer." Kevin stammered. It's a mistake. I thought I saw no mistake." I said, "Just a bad plan." By noon, Kevin had been suspended and placed under internal investigation. Within 48 hours, he was arrested for evidence tampering and conspiracy. The HOA's protection from law enforcement was gone. Bryce disappeared the next day quietly. No farewell, no goodbyes. Just a vacant enforcement seat and a note left at the HOA office that read, "I won't be part of this anymore." The dominoes had started to fall. Miranda and Simon scheduled a last-minute HOA board meeting, another closed session, held not at the clubhouse, but in Miranda's home. What they didn't know was that Tom, working within legal parameters, had already submitted a court motion for transparency due to their repeated violations of open meeting laws. He had authorization to record. We planted a device in the planter box outside her living room window, motion-activated. High-gain microphone. What we heard that night would destroy what little remained of their credibility. "We have to drain the reserve account," Simon said in the recording. "Use it for legal fees before they freeze the assets." "We'll approve an emergency assessment," Miranda replied. $2,000 per household. Blame it on community legal protection. And the Carters, another voice asked. "Dig. Something on the wife. Job violation, past medical case, anything we can spin. If not—" Miranda paused, then added coldly, "We'll make something up." I listened to the audio 3 times that night. Not because I needed confirmation, but because I needed to feel the full weight of what we were up against. This wasn't just about rule violations. It was conspiracy, abuse of power, fraud, retaliation. But now, we had evidence, and with it, the law on our side. Tom filed an emergency injunction the next morning to freeze all HOA spending until a forensic audit could be conducted. At the same time, Rebecca released a follow-up story titled "The Attempted Framing of Jack Carter." It included still shots from the camera footage, the arrest report for Officer Kevin, and quotes from the state investigator confirming that formal hearings had been scheduled. That week, I walked through the neighborhood differently. Not with the invisible armor I wore before, but with something stronger momentum. The fear they had ruled with was cracking, and we were just getting started. The emergency injunction froze every cent Miranda and Simon had hoped to drain from the HOA's reserve fund. And while they scrambled to explain themselves behind closed doors, we prepared for the next step, exposing everything in public, all at once, with no more polite meetings or restrained suggestions. We were going to put their entire kingdom on trial, not just legally. Socially, morally, visibly. We called for a community-wide meeting to be held in the clubhouse, backed by over 60 resident signatures, more than enough to invoke our right to a special session under HOA Bylaw 9.4. Miranda tried to block it, citing ongoing legal reviews, but the state injunction overrode her. That meeting would proceed with or without her blessing. 112 residents showed up. It was the largest attendance in Silver Pines history. There were folding chairs lined against the walls, neighbors leaning in door frames, people standing outside with phones recording through the open windows. And there, under a slightly flickering light panel, I stood and told the story from beginning to end. I didn't dramatize. I didn't exaggerate. I simply laid it out how Emily had been assaulted under the guise of an inspection, how we'd been cited for fabricated violations, how HOA funds had been funneled into shell corporations linked to Miranda's relatives, how Officer Kevin had attempted to frame me, and how we caught it all on tape. Then I played the audio, the recording from Miranda's home. The room went silent as her voice came through the speakers. "We'll approve an emergency assessment. Blame it on community legal protection." Then Simon's voice. "Use the reserve account before they freeze the assets." And finally, Miranda again. "Dig something up on the wife. Or make something up." When the audio ended, the silence was no longer passive. It was boiling. Several residents stood and demanded resignations. One woman shouted through tears, "I paid a $200 fine for wind chimes." Another man held up a foreclosure notice dated 3 months earlier and simply said, "They ruined us. They ruined." But it wasn't just outrage that filled that room. It was vindication. For every quiet neighbor who had tiptoed under threat of citation. For every elderly couple who'd torn down their own improvements in fear. For every kid told to remove their chalk drawings from the sidewalk we had pulled back the curtain. Then, something unexpected happened. Bryce showed up. He walked through the back door of the clubhouse with his head down and hands in his pockets. Several people started whispering, but I looked at him and nodded. Slowly. He made his way forward. "I'd like to speak," he said. Nobody stopped him. He walked to the front of the room, turned toward the residents. and said, "My name is Bryce Williams. I was the HOA's enforcement officer. I carried out dozens of those citations. I trespassed on your property. I took pictures through your windows. I enforced rules that weren't applied equally." A pause. I did it because I was told it was legal. But that's not an excuse. I knew it felt wrong, but I needed the job. I needed to feel like I mattered. Then one day I injured a woman who'd done nothing but defend her home. And later, in a hospital bed, that same woman treated me with dignity I didn't deserve. He turned to Emily. "You gave me the chance to feel human again. And I want you to know I testified. I've turned over emails, meeting notes, texts. They can't hide anymore." For the first time since this began, I saw Miranda's empire crack not from above, but from within. 3 days later, the arrests were made. Miranda Kane and Simon Weeks were taken into custody on charges of embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. The search warrants uncovered multiple bank accounts, including one offshore totaling over $370,000 in misappropriated HOA funds. Investigators found invoices for non-existent landscaping services, inflated security contracts, and even payments for Miranda's cosmetic surgeries and Simon's gambling debts. The county police chief, under pressure from the press and internal watchdogs, issued a public apology. "We failed to investigate when we should have. We failed to protect residents who reported abuse. That will change." Officer Kevin was dismissed from the force and later sentenced to 18 months for evidence tampering and abuse of power. Bryce, thanks to his cooperation and remorse, received probation and community service assigned to a local veterans center, where, ironically, he began teaching de-escalation techniques to private security workers. As for Silver Pines, the illusion shattered. But in its place, something more honest began to grow. A temporary board was formed, made up of residents from all backgrounds: retirees, parents, veterans, nurses. The first order of business was a full financial audit and a repeal of every fine issued during Miranda's tenure. Those affected were refunded in full. And me, I stood in front of that same clubhouse, beside the trellis I had built by hand. The roses Emily planted had finally come into bloom, their vines thick and fragrant, wrapping gently around the cedar like time healing over an old wound. I didn't smile for photos or accept any kind of title. I wasn't interested in running anything, but I stayed long enough to speak to the room one last time. This trellis was cited as a violation. I said, "It wasn't. It was a test. A test of how far people would go to enforce rules that served no one but themselves. What we've learned is that communities don't need more control. They need courage. And when one person stands up, others will too." Emily was standing beside me, arm fully healed, eyes bright. The kingdom Miranda built on fear, paper fines, and silence had fallen. In its place rose something far more dangerous to tyrants: a united neighborhood. The kingdom Miranda built had fallen, and in its place, something new had begun to take root. It wasn't immediate. Healing never is. But day by day, we began to see what a community could look like when fear was no longer the operating system. Silver Pines transformed not into a utopia, but into something real. The artificial polish was gone, replaced by something more organic, more honest. Front yards grew character. Conversations replaced citations. People started waving again, not because they were expected to, but because they wanted to. Bryce, after completing his probation, began volunteering full-time at the local Veterans Center. I stopped by one afternoon to drop off some materials for a civic engagement workshop and found him leading a group discussion on de-escalation and ethical enforcement. The same man who once trespassed with a camera in hand now stood before younger vets, teaching them how not to become what he had been. He looked up, caught my eye, and gave a nod. No apology needed. His actions had already spoken. Emily, ever steady, launched a health literacy program through the community center. What started as a once-a-month workshop quickly grew into weekly sessions attended by nurses, caregivers, and even high school students. She focused not just on medicine, but on agency, helping patients understand their rights, ask hard questions, and advocate for their care. One evening, I sat at the back of her class, watching her speak with her hands, the way she always did when she was passionate. Her shoulder had long healed, but the sling that once symbolized our pain had been replaced by a presence that commanded trust and quiet admiration. The woman they tried to silence had become the loudest voice for healing. As for me, I found myself teaching too. Once a month. I hosted a seminar at the community center titled "How to Fight Without a Rifle." It wasn't about warfare, it was about resilience. About using documentation, law, and community as shields. About how systems break when you shine enough light on their cracks. Other neighborhoods started calling, first from nearby counties, then from out of state. People wanted to know how we did it, how we stood our ground without going to war. I shared everything: our timelines, templates, legal paths, and even our missteps. If others could learn from our fight, maybe fewer people would have to bleed figuratively or otherwise just to keep their homes and their dignity. And Silver Pines, it became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of reclamation. The new board eliminated fines for cosmetic issues, implemented quarterly open forums, and required third-party audits for all major expenses. HOA fees dropped by 35%, not because of any magical restructuring, but because theft had stopped and transparency had begun. 1 year after Miranda's arrest, a local magazine ran a cover story titled "The Neighborhood That Fought Back." A young reporter came to interview me. He was sharp-eyed, full of questions. Any regrets, he asked, pen hovering. I looked across the lawn, where kids chalked colorful drawings on the sidewalk, drawings that would have once earned their parents a violation. I watched Emily laugh with a neighbor over garden herbs. I saw Bryce walking an elderly vet back to his car, carrying the man's groceries. Then I turned to the reporter. "I spent 30 years fighting for my country," I said. "But this was the first time I fought for my neighbors. And we won." He smiled, clicked his pen shut, and left quietly. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed everything in gold, Emily and I sat on the porch beneath the trellis I'd built her. The vines had filled in completely now, thick with Bloom's roses, clematis, a splash of jasmine she'd planted last spring. Butterflies hovered. The breeze was kind. She leaned her head against my shoulder. "You think they'd try it again somewhere else? They already are," I replied. "But somewhere, someone will fight back. They'll remember what we did here." And we sat like that for a while, not speaking, just breathing, just being. Because in the end, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about fines or rules or bylaws. It was about restoring what they tried to steal: dignity, trust, and the simple right to live without fear. Justice had been served. The guilty were held accountable. And in their absence, something better had bloomed. Sometimes the best revenge is restoring what they tried to destroy. Was I too harsh, or did they deserve it? I'd love to hear your take.